I know we talked like what we touched on what would need to happen for like real change to occur. But is there anything else you'd like to add to that, like especially institutionally, policy wise, and then individually for change?
So you're basically asking what would need to happen for real change to occur within our institutions and society in general. So this is, there's no easy answer. I want to say that first. Because we've been neglectful for so long and we're still fighting about, is there even really an issue? Inequity? Is there isms that are existing? We're still fighting about that. I mean, as a country, I mean, we're pretty much split down the middle too, 50-50. But in order for real change to occur, first you have to acknowledge there is a problem. So I'm concerned that after all these years, and even with videotaped evidence, and even with people sharing their stories, and even with social media and so forth, that we still have this huge divide in realities and acceptance of each other's stories, that there is a problem. So we have to acknowledge there is a problem. There has to be enough of a mass of people. It's not going to be everyone, but that bell curve again, on that bell curve, that bell in the middle, if we could get enough of a mass group of people to admit that there is a problem, that would help. And then it really is going to require some dismantling of how we've set up our institutions to favor certain groups over others. This is the challenging thing too, because that means as a board member in an institution that I'm not going to go out looking for Kinko copies of myself to sit on the board with me, that I'm going to purposely look for the board members, the employees that I hire to represent a diverse perspective and talent pool that by itself can lend to changing the institution we're operating out of. So for example, I think education is one of our critical institutions. You were asking me earlier if I had to prioritize, if we were only going to work on one at a time. For me, education would be at the top because we need critical, analytical, knowledge-based thinkers to identify, see, and come up with potential interventions for a problem. And education, when it's done right, and not only from a Eurocentric perspective, creates a broad mind, a broad bandwidth, where we are growing individuals who are talented and who question, who analyze, who can see from a macro system perspective and even a micro system perspective. When we do it right, you have people coming to the table within organizations and institutions who are much more prepared in their brilliance to address key issues. So in that organization or institution again, if I'm working and fixing education so that all people are educated and from a holistic, pluralistic perspective, then as a white male who may be overseeing a company, I'm going to make a committed effort to hire people who reflect our world. We're a global society. And see, all this isolationist talk is so dangerous because anyone who knows really knows that what happens here affects what happens over the ocean and vice versa. Eventually, what we're seeing in other places, it's going to come here. So if we have a virus, it ain't going to stay in Africa, or it's not going to stay in Asia, or it's not going to stay in some part of Europe. Eventually, because people travel and they fly and they communicate and they go to outings, it's going to hit people where they're at. Makes sense, right? The same is true with an institution. So if we're talking about making real difference, we need people who reflect the world and not who just look like they reflect the world, right? So Clarence Thomas looks like an African American, but from his voting and how he votes and all that, no offense to Clarence Thomas, he does not represent what most of the African American community is looking for. So it can't just be a visual mosaic, a visual, United Nations. It has to be a visual perspective and consciousness. I'm talking about conscious people who know who they are, where they come from, how we're connected, and they know history. So when you bring people like that within an institution and you make an effort and you say, geez, 90% of our employees are like in Silicon Valley, 60 or 70% of our employees are all white. We need to change that paradigm. We really do, even if we don't see it as an advantage right now. Eventually, it will be an advantage in perspective and coming up with things that will make that institution healthier. Maybe everyone sits at the table and says, ooh, it's so messed up, we need to reconfigure. I think a lot of that needs to happen too, to be honest with you. But you have people who are sitting down at the table who hopefully have the best interests of all people in it. And that's when you start the wheels turning just a little bit towards deep institutional change. So, of course, we have to admit there's a problem. We have to have dialogue to deal with all our feelings and hurt and anger, because everyone has feelings about what's happened. And when you don't acknowledge someone's feeling or hurt, it stays within them. When you tell me that people who look like me just need to get that chip off their shoulder and stop playing the race card, I'm like, what deck of cards have I missed? I don't know any cards that give me any advantage. I always crack up at that one. I'm like, the race card? Really? I could do a comedy about that. That's just so funny. Help me find that deck that's going to give me advantage in all those institutions. But when you deny me individually and as a group of people and other people of color, and like I said, all the other groups that we could talk about here right now, their story, their history, what has hurt them and harmed them, you are denying my very being and my very existence. So dialogue and dealing with that and getting over white guilt and making some movement in the pain that people have who've been oppressed and acknowledging the reality and the history is a part of that. And then you get these educated people who've come from an educated system that's been reformed and that benefits everybody. And you get them into our institutions and they start dismantling step by step, policy by policy, inequity by inequity, institutions. It is not happen fundamentally because there are people who are vested in keeping the status quo. We need to understand that. There are people who don't want to give up their power. There are people who know history and they use it in a manipulative way to keep the status quo. There are people who try to divide groups who should be working together. For example, working class white people should be in most all coalitions as people of color. They are getting hit hard too. But because of the manipulation of fear and appealing to their whiteness and those parts of themselves that make them feel that they need to be in solidarity with the top 1% or those who are doing very well, they often vote against their own best interests. This is, again, manipulative politics, propaganda, and so forth. So we need to understand that there's always going to be a group of people who don't want to see it change. They're actually very educated, and they use that to miseducate others. And that's part of the reason why we haven't made progress, too. And in that manipulation, like we're seeing right now, I don't really care for Donald Trump, but I'm more concerned about the masses who are following him than I am about Donald Trump and what that reveals and what that means in its entirety. It's a lot of stuff to process. So, but to change things, we got to, like, what's that song, looking at the person in the mirror? We got to look at ourselves and go through what we need to get to a certain level, because this is a lifelong process. So we can't wait to the end of our lives to say, I'm ready to change now. But we want to get to a threshold of a place, maybe on a scale of 1 to 100, you're at a 40, where you can start being a part of groups and coalitions who are about change. I would like to see boards, employees, if we're doing things equitably, it should reflect what we're seeing in our country in every way within an organization and institution. And because our institutions are by and large toxic in a lot of ways, it's like a think tank that needs to come together and examine every policy, practice, construct, whatever that is hindering equity and people having a fair shot to survive and thrive. And then identifying those and coming up with practices and interventions to directly address them and change them. And in some cases, realizing it's going to require revolutionary reform. Again, revolutionary conjures up images that aren't the ones I'm thinking about. It's just about doing the right thing, I feel like we have an accountability to ourselves, our children, our community, our higher powers, however you identify that for yourself. And most people who profess to have a higher power are some of the ones who need to work on this the most. Okay? How you can claim to believe in a God as you are subjugating the poor, forgetting about the widows, abusing them in prison and those that you're about to put in prison, not caring about the poverty that is wiping out communities. I would challenge you in your faith, if you profess to have one, to read your book of belief. Because most of the books I've read, whether it's the Quran, the Bible, whatever texts, spiritual texts are out there, most of them have edicts about the poor, the helpless, advocating for those people, and not treating them and not treating them in bad ways or oppressing them. And yet, I think I saw a statistic that 60 or 70% of people profess to believe in a God or a higher power. And I'm like, well, then why do we got this mess down here, right? So all these different levels. So institutional change, whether it's in religion, whether it's in our texts at schools. Oh my God, I mean, we could have a summit, and there has been many summits. And by the way, if PhDs were the solution, we wouldn't be seeing this mess that we're still seeing in this very day. I respect PhDs, but I want people who have research knowledge and applied practice and experience to be at those summits. Meaning you can write about a group of people and how they're doing, and you can study them from afar, and many people do. I see them at conferences all the time and never have interacted with the very group you're studying, and then be all over the news because of your credentials and your apparent expertise, giving suggestions for communities you've never stepped in and would not even drive through because you'd be afraid to. There's a problem with that. So that's another thing we have to do. We have to be real. So step in my shoes. I'll step in your shoes. Look at every institution from the smallest to the highest. Does it reflect your world? And by that, again, I don't mean just by appearance. I mean by perspective. Come up with interventions to address the things that are shortcomings.